I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor, and I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
We're the Editing Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Editing Podcast. So, Denise, tell everybody what we're talking about this week.
so this week, I'm interviewing you.
What?
That's right. You are going to tell me 4 things I'd need to know if I wanted to become a fiction editor, which I don't, by the way. Not ever. But lots of people do. So it's a great topic to chat about. Now, we could talk all day about this. So we're going to keep it lean and focus on 4 key things, aren't we?
Yeah.
So the main types of fiction editing and the kinds of things a fiction editor needs to look out for, what additional training you might need, the market and client expectations, and the need for a flexible hand.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yep. You're up for that?
Yeah, I'm up for that.
Okay, so let's start with the types of editing. And I guess what I want to understand is where there's a crossover with non-fiction editing and where there are differences. So let's start with the crossover.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. At foundational level, there's plenty of crossover. We're dealing with macro level structural work like developmental editing, critiques that assess the manuscript strengths and weaknesses and its suitability for the target audience, and sensitivity reading, which I guess, even if it's not called that in the nonfiction market, is still carried out. So I know you've edited nonfic and I had to check for suitability for that market. How does that work then?
Absolutely, yeah. And it doesn't matter whether you're editing fiction or non-fiction. The foundations are the same. There has to be a good structure and a logical progression in non-fiction. So I would think that's similar to like the narrative arc in fiction. It has to get its message or its story across, and it has to appeal to a specific market or readership.
Right, yeah. So then I guess with fiction, then there's sentence level editing, such as stylistic line editing, copy editing, and quality control proofreading. I think the differences come to the fore when we consider the detail of what's being done at those different levels rather than the scope of the editing itself.
Right, yeah, okay then. So let's focus on the macro first. You call it developmental or structural editing, just like I would for nonfiction. So it's big picture work, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So we might call it also story level editing, because ultimately it's about looking at whether the story works. So developmental fiction editors will be looking at things like plot, story structure and pacing, author style and character voice, world building, setting, and perspective, whether the dialogue is effective, the character's goals, motivations, and conflicts, the narration style, whether point of view is working, the overall narrative arc, which you mentioned before in your work, or the equivalent of, and also genre considerations.
That's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you don't offer developmental editing, and yet I hear you talk about dialogue and viewpoint a lot. So does that mean that the lines between developmental work and stylistic line editing are a bit blurry?
You're spot on, definitely. And I feel strongly that anybody wanting to move into stylistic work, even if it's at sentence level, needs to grasp narrative viewpoint and how characters speak. Because that stuff is happening at the line level. And while it's not always easy to fix at a line editing stage, if there are problems, an editor needs to be able to understand what those are so that they can reflect on it and explain why they're recasting or asking the author to go away and think about it. So it's a case of you might not actually be doing the work, but you need to recognize that you need to recognize that somebody needs to do it. You need to understand what the problems are and be able to articulate them.
Yeah, even if you're not actually going to do that work yourself, you
Yeah.
need to be able to, it's like you need to know
Yeah.
what you don't know.
Yeah.
You need to know enough to know that it's not what you deal with, but
Yeah.
Okay, got you, right. All right, then, so let's look at line editing. What are you looking out for when you do this kind of work, and what are the problems that you most often encounter?
So I'm looking out for authentic phrasing that fits with the character's voice, character trait consistency, that the dialogue is interesting and driving the story forward, but also that it's tagged and punctuated conventionally. I'm also looking at the narrative, the text outside the dialogue, to make sure it's engaging and compelling and tight. I'm looking at tenses and whether they make sense. I'm also considering the narration style, so whether the author's using, for example, a first, second, or third person style. And within that, whether the narrative viewpoint is consistent and logical. And I'm also considering narrative distance, how close the reader feels to the character, and whether that's shifting seamlessly and not just stuck in one place so that it's either overwhelming or dead boring.
Yeah, that's a total mystery to me how you do that.
Well, actually, I'm presenting about that very thing at the CIEP, so you can come and listen to me
I'll
if you
come and
want,
listen and
Denise.
learn from you. Definitely, definitely. Yeah. All right then. Well, that is definitely an area that I need to understand a bit better because I think sometimes those sort of things do feed into like working with memoir and things like that too.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, all
Yeah.
that creative nonfiction you do,
Absolutely. Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. All right then. So moving on, can we just talk a little bit about point of view? Because to the uninitiated, it might seem a bit confusing. Just start by explaining what that is. I mean, I know it's a big topic, but just give me your in a nutshell version.
Okay. So, viewpoint is the perspective through which we experience the story as readers. A viewpoint character is the one whose interior space we have access to. So, we can hear and see through that. No, we can't see through their eyes.
You can't
Yeah,
hear
we
through their
can. We
eyes.
can't hear through their eyes. We can see through their eyes and hear through their ears, move in their bodies, and know their thoughts and emotions. Omniscient narrations allow readers to access everyone's thoughts, but they're really difficult to master and I think quite difficult to edit. And
Mhm.
most authors these days working on commercial fiction tend to write in a third person limited point of view. And that brings with it restrictions.
Okay, I'm just going to stop you right there.
Yeah.
Explain, give an example of third person limited point of view. I put you on the spot here.
Right. Yeah. So third person limited is so called because it's a deeper viewpoint that limits readers to a single character's experience, what they see, hear, feel, and think. And readers get to sit in their skin, and that provides quite an immersive experience. It's as if we are them. But it's called third person limited for a reason, because strictly speaking, what that character can't see or know shouldn't be reported. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yes. So you're in the person, but you don't know what anybody else is thinking.
Yeah, so it's kind of
Right.
like real life. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, whereas something like omniscient, which I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
the narrator has access to all of the characters. It's like they're sort of telepathic or something, and they can access all the different characters' minds, all the
Mhm.
events. They can roam anywhere. That's
Right.
why it's a really tricky thing to write and a tricky thing to edit
Mm.
because it's difficult to keep control over. Whereas
Yeah.
once you kind of know the rules, the limitations of a third person limited point of view, um, then as long as you abide by those, it's easier to stay in control, and therefore that's easier for the editor as well. But an editor again does need to be familiar with the various different narration styles. That's really
Definitely.
fun.
Yeah.
But when the boundaries of those restrictions, those limitations I talked about are broken, we say an author's dropped viewpoint or head hopped. And it's a common problem that less experienced fiction writers are prone to. And that's why I think it's a concept that even those of us who are working at sentence level, we need to grasp it. It really is something that should have been dealt with a level of editing beforehand, but not authors don't always go through the various stages of editing in the way that we'd like them to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And certainly hanging out in various online, editors groups, dropped viewpoint or head hopping, it's something that it comes up time and
Mm,
again
mm.
with editors asking about it or how to deal with it, or is this, head hopping?
And it
So,
and it really spoils. It can, you can have a great story, but it actually stops the reader investing in a
mhm,
particular character. And
yeah,
I mean, there are some writers who do omniscient narrations really well. I'll tell you when it works fantastically. That narration style is with satirical fiction. Some of those old masters like Dickens and Thackeray often
right.
write in omniscient.
Hmm.
If you take a look and once you can identify that sort of all-seeing, godlike, omniscient eye casting its
Yeah,
gaze over the it gives it can be great for satire because it allows the narrator or the author through that narrative voice to poke a little bit of fun at their characters. Um, but
That's
in that case, you are very much asking the reader to step outside. You're not
right.
you're not sort of immersing them in that person's head and their
Mhm.
emotional experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, particularly because I'm a non-fiction editor, I never even thought about it in my pleasure reading before I got to know you and learn a bit more about it. I mean, I don't think I ever even noticed it, and I suppose that's the thing about good writing is that your attention shouldn't be drawn to it, really.
Again, you've nailed it. When viewpoints handle well, the reading experience is seamless and we feel engaged with the story and the character experience. And that's just it. We don't notice it. I bet the fiction you've read and loved in the past 12 months has been in great shape in terms of narrative point of view. If it wasn't, you
Mhm.
probably didn't feel perhaps um, as engaged with the characters, or maybe you got bored with the novel, or
Yeah,
you felt the characterization was a bit flat. There probably something would have jarred if it
yeah.
wasn't
Well,
handled
certainly
well.
some of the really good stuff that I've read recently has come on your recommendations. So I don't think
Yeah,
you'd recommend stuff to me that wasn't tight in that sort of respect.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, there are things like obviously if an author's writing in first person, that's a really easy way to help make ensure that they hold viewpoint, because it's very difficult to write from the perspective of I
Hmm.
and accidentally start reporting what somebody else can think. Or
But is that something that maybe inexperienced authors do without realizing it?
not so much with
Really?
first person narratives, but
Right.
um I won't get into it, but there are other sort of other challenges with that sometimes
Okay.
with first person narrations, in that I think sometimes authors can spend too much time in when we
Right.
talked earlier about narrative distance, but they can spend so much time in that eye space and
Hmm.
too much time perhaps focusing on the emotional interior space of the character's experience, that actually it becomes a bit exhausting, and
Right.
and we
Right.
and we can't actually dig into the story. So just thinking what you and I were talking about, the books we've recommended each other recently,
Hmm.
ultimately we've enjoyed those because they're a cracking story. They've got
Yeah.
great plot, and you
You
went on a
move on.
journey from A to
Yeah.
B, and you weren't so exhausted because or drained by constantly being slammed with the kind of whirl of someone's emotional experience
Yeah.
constantly. So it's all about control.
Yeah. Very good.
But it's
Right. Okay.
but it is the only other thing I say, it's quite a gut feeling to a lot of this. There's not.
A lot of instinct on
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Okay. All right then. So, what other sort of problems do you find that you come across quite often?
So overwriting is common. Lots of exposition that repeats what the author's already shown through dialogue, or prose that's rather flat and reads like a shopping list. It's what we call told prose, and it can be really boring to read, lacking in tension, prose that makes you not want to turn the page. So
Mm,
it's
right.
it's expository. It explains things. You do need that because that's about moving the story forward. But it's
It
kind
can
of
be
the
too
opposite.
much of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
the opposite of what I was talking about before. You can either
Yeah.
have too much emotional, too much exposition, um, and so with that overwriting, that the story's there, it's behind it, but it might be a case for the fiction editor of helping the author tease it out by tightening up sentences and letting it sing.
Yeah. Got you.
And another big thing is dialogue that's too realistic.
Now, how can that be a thing? I mean, isn't realistic dialogue a good thing?
Actually, not always. Think about the conversations you have with people, the conversations that you and I have, and how much.
Right, a lot of nonsense most
Yeah,
of the
yeah. A lot of fluff is in there. And
time.
think about how if someone read a transcript of us chatting, they'd be bored rigid by a lot of it. The pleasantries, the mundane stuff
Yeah.
that only you and I are interested in, about how we're just going to make a cuppa and whether there's any milk in the fridge, and the all the umming and ahhing we do. Phew.
Are you calling me boring, Harnby?
I'm not bored by our convos, but I bet a lot of listeners to our catch-up chat about how our day's been would be.
Well, it's true, yeah.
Yeah, those just aren't conversations that are crafted for readers or listeners. They're personal.
Mm,
And so while they're really, really important in real life, dialogue needs to respect the fact that the readers bought a novel, and the dialogue therefore needs to function for readers. And that means that editors need to be helping authors craft a sort of hybrid that sounds just realistic enough to be natural, but that omits all the incidental boring stuff.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, again, when I think back to my pleasure reading, you're right. The dialogue is only the interesting stuff, not how many sugars someone takes in their tea.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right, then. So let's move on and talk about training. So, how does an editor learn this stuff? Because that's not in foundational editorial training. I mean, the sort of core skills stuff.
No. But I do think that core skills training is a great first start because it teaches you about publishing industry standards and conventions. And if you're fiction editing for indie authors, you need to know that stuff because the writer might not, or they think they don't.
Mm.
We covered this very issue, didn't we, on the issue on the episode on training.
Yes,
So
yeah.
as you've pointed out, you have expectations about your fiction because you've been reading for eons and you want a book to be compelling. You want to engage with the characters.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of expect it to look a certain way too.
Mm,
So, I expect the speech to be punctuated in a certain way, the paragraph spacing to look like it always looks.
yeah,
And I expect it to be readable and to get to the point. I want to turn the page and not be bored, just like a textbook.
yeah,
Plus, I imagine if you're proofreading fiction for publishers, they'll be expecting you to mark up according to industry standard practice.
exactly. And they'll have a house style guide too that will determine spelling and punctuation style and layout guidelines that sentence level editors need to adhere to. Plus, there's other things that core skills training rams into you: consistency, clarity, and sense. So I always recommend that fiction editors start in the same place as non-fiction editors.
Absolutely, that just makes an awful lot of
Yeah,
sense, really.
yeah.
Yeah. So after that, what about specialist training? Do you think it's enough to do core skills on their own?
So there are specialist fiction editing courses and books that help editors hone their craft at both developmental and sentence level. We can include a link in the show notes to a booklet I've created that lists some of those and some books on the subject. But what I also recommend is that wannabe fiction editors read a lot of fiction.
Mm.
That's a great starting point, particularly the fiction they most want to edit, because that's how you can start to see what works and how the authors you love reading captivate you. Do I think core skills are enough? I think we need more than that, precisely because of those issues we've already discussed: overwriting, exposition, viewpoint, dialogue. Editors need to be able to guide their authors, and to do that, they need to understand how those things work, when there are problems and when there aren't, and how to edit mindfully, which, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but that might mean ignoring something that wouldn't be acceptable in a non-fic text.
All right. So give me an example of that then, if you can.
So we've chatted about this before, but a non-fiction editor might see a sentence with no commas in it and think there's a mistake, or that the punctuation is poor or sloppy. A fiction editor might recognize that a particular literary device is in play, something called polysyndeton. It's a rhythmic tool that helps to convey emotion. You're going to ask me what that is now, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So polysyndeton is when a sentence, instead of having the usual structure, which might be "I like oranges, comma, apples, and pears," um, polysyndeton would remove those commas and just have conjunctions instead. So it might be "I like oranges and apples and pears and fruit
Right.
and crisps and cake and pie."
All
And
right. We don't need to know what you had for your dinner tonight.
but
But yeah,
it's
I
a really
get it.
powerful rhythmic tool that helps to convey emotion. And so editing that out would be butchery. Yet the
Yeah.
same kind of issue in one of your business texts might be completely inappropriate, and you'd need to attend to it. So fiction editors need to learn about that stuff, so that they get it.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. Definitely. Yeah. Polysyndeton. There's something that I don't have to deal with on the daily.
Yes,
Yes.
you'll probably it might sometimes come up in one of your memoirs in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it would.
Could
And
do.
as you've said before, being able to recognize that for what it
Mm,
is important.
mm.
Yeah. So now let's move on and talk a bit about the market and client expectations. So you've mentioned publishers and indie authors, but I'm getting the sense that perhaps those two markets might at times need treating quite differently. I know they certainly do when it comes to non-fic in my experience.
Definitely. So publishers tend to use editing terminology much like you and I use it. They won't expect a proofreader to be doing structural work, and they know what the order of play is in terms of the different levels of editing. But and like you say, this is the same in the non-fic indie market. Indie authors might ask for one type of editing, say copy editing, and expect that the editor will be handling stylistic or structural problems. Or they might think they're ready for proofreading, even though the book hasn't been through any of the editing stages.
Mm.
And so that's again why fiction editors need to understand those core concepts and literary devices that are specific to fiction so that they can ask a potential client the right questions and assess from a sample whether what the author's asked for is what their book actually needs.
Yeah, and while the issues might be different in terms of those literary devices you mentioned, that principle of not making assumptions about terminology or expectations, well, that's exactly the same across the whole editing spectrum when it comes to working with those beyond the mainstream publishing
Yeah,
industry.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So to wrap up, let's now talk about that flexible hand. We sort of got onto that when we talked about polysyndeton, but I want to dig a little bit deeper. So
Okay.
essentially, we're talking about prescriptivism, aren't we?
That dreaded word.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my take on this is that if you want to edit fiction, you need to embrace rule breaking.
Yeah.
Um, So you and me are both invested in respecting style, but I suspect that for you, that might mean considering things like brand, house style, layout, and other technical issues more often
Mhm.
than for me, where style might mean thinking a little bit more about author preferences and character voice. Certainly in the work that you do for, say, uh, your business publishers and
Yeah.
your social science publishers, as
Hmm.
opposed to me working with it directly with indie authors.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, for example, you might be asked by a client to use the serial comma for the most part, whereas commas for me have they have a grammatical function, but they can also affect suspense and drama and tension. And so a fiction editor needs to be able to chill out and put the style guides to one side if voice and rhythm are being served without damaging readability. It doesn't matter what the Chicago Manual of Style recommends in terms of how to render numbers, for example. It's a
Hmm.
useful style guide, but if implementing that guidance would make, say, the dialogue awkward or not fit with character voice, then the editor needs to be ready to ignore it.
Yeah.
And style guides, I think, with fiction often have little to say about rhythm and mood and emotion. And so I think prescriptivism is a particularly poor fit for fiction editing and can lead
Mhm.
to editors damaging a text rather than improving it. So if you're a prescriptivist, like probably I don't go into this field.
Just yeah, or learn to chill out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, one or the other.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So let me ask you one more thing. Do you think it's a fiction editor's job to offer a recast if the sentence isn't working, or is it enough to flag up the problem? I've my own take on this for the work I do, but I've seen it asked by newbie fiction editors before, so I'm interested in your take.
So, like you, I suspect for me, it depends on what I've been hired to do. Scope creep is a killer. So, if
Hmm.
you've been hired to proofread and I've made it clear that's what I'm going to include, I'm not going to spend hours suggesting recast. But if I've been hired to line edit, so stylistic work, I'd always offer a solution. I'm
Right.
not being hired to be a writer, that's true. But if I think that the dialogue isn't working, I think I should be offering an alternative that would work. At least something to help the author. They don't have to follow it, but they,
You could nudge them to
yeah,
think
like
about it. Yeah.
to give them something to even decide. No, I don't want to do it like this, but I
Hmm.
see what she's getting at. So
Yeah.
and so yes, in that case, I think when it comes to line editing, I think it comes with a job,
Yeah.
a willingness to do it.
Yeah. And that, again, that comes back to what we talked about in terms of learning about the specialist aspects of fiction editing and those literary devices and tools I hear you witching on about, Harnby. You know, free indirect speech. That's another of your
Oh,
favorites.
it is.
Let's not go there today. The point is that to offer that recast or decide to leave the text alone, you need to know first what the problem is, or even if there is a problem. And then secondly, how to communicate that. And third, how it might be done better.
Yeah,
And that does mean specialist learning, either through books or courses. Yeah.
that's it. God, I love free indirect style. It's a little bit of magic.
Enough, Harnby. So that's it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can rate, review, and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you prefer.
Yes, thank you so much for listening to the Editing Podcast. We'll pop that link of that guide that I mentioned in the show notes. And just to let you know, we will be doing this with Denise. I'll be putting her on the spot. But for now, she's been Denise.
And she's been Louise. Join us again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.